For in the Second World War turned the globe into a battlefield. Over 80 years later, the war is fast slipping out of living memory, but the remains of that terrible conflict can still be found all around us today, from megabunkers to bullet hole shipwrecks to cemeteries. Music. I'm James Rogers, a war historian who is fascinated by these time capsules. They tell us the stories of death and glory, ingenuity, and desperation. Now, for the History Hit YouTube channel, I'll be looking for the last traces of World War II. On the 26th of May, 1940, the situation of the British Expeditionary Force in France was looking dire, pushed back to the sea by the rampant German blitzkrieg. The majority were now trapped in a pocket on the northern French coast. The odds were stacked firmly against them. Just before 7 p.m. that evening, Churchill ordered the evacuation. The eyes of the world would be on the French port of Dunkirk. Music. What happened over the next few days would go down in history. An audacious attempt to get as many out as possible. Failure would have meant certain defeat for the British. It would have meant surrender. The Germans were slow in closing the pocket around Dunkirk, thanks in part to a stiff rearguard action put up by the Allies. To minimize the risk to their own troops, the German High Command ordered the Luftwaffe to put an end to any ambitions of escape by destroying the city and port from the air, and there is still evidence of that brutal onslaught on Dunkirk's buildings today. Music. This is St. Eloi Church, and you can see the massive chunks taken out of the stone here now. This occurred during the First World War, which is astonishing to think. And in fact, it was rebuilt after the war. This would have been taken out by bits of shrapnel or perhaps even machine gun fire. You can even still see the bullet holes that litter all the way across the facade of the church now. The astonishing thing is, in the Second World War, incendiary bombs took this whole building out. It was left a burnt-out shell. But still today, you look on the front here, and you can see all of the bullet holes you can buy in the First World War and the Second World War damage. And the clear thing to see is you don't want to be in Dunkirk when there's a World War. Music. The bombing raids were devastating. It knocked out the town's water supply, meaning fires couldn't be put out, and over 1,000 civilians were killed. Crucially, though, for the British, the port, the best means of escape, was crippled and put out of action, realizing that evacuating the men directly from the beaches was going to be far too slow. Senior naval officer Captain William Tennant, the man overseeing Operation Dynamo on the ground, looked for a solution to the problem. Music. Today, the port has been rebuilt, but there are still lingering remains of that amazing feat pulled off by the British. Music. This is the East Mole Pact today, with Dunkirk's sea fishing community rather than the escaping Allied forces of 1940. The mole is actually a huge breakwater that stretches a mile out to sea. It was built to keep the waters in the port calm and free of the chop from the channel. Crucially, this is not designed to take ships alongside. However, with the rest of the port out of action, Tennant and his men pressed the mole into service for him. Music has entered into the mythology of the Dunkirk evacuation, and with good reason. Over the next week, the East Mole would see over 200,000 troops embark on his ships back to Blighty. Now, the mole might have been the major exit point for most of the men out of Dunkirk, but the beaches all along here to the east of the city were the staging posts. Look, these beaches saw snaked queues, thousands of men long, all waiting either to get on the mole into the port or to be taken off by smaller craft directly from the beaches. The military hardware of the British Army was simply abandoned here. This evacuation was all about the men. If you come down to the beaches of Dunkirk today, it's hard to imagine the sheer scale of the operation that took place here. Hundreds of thousands of men packed into these beaches with all of their military equipment. But if you come down here on an especially low tide and you know where to look, it starts to reveal some of its secrets, because the waters all along Dunkirk's coast are a veritable shipwreck graveyard. Music. Oh, this is the HMS Crested Eagle. She was a Thames paddle steamer built in 1925, but then pressed into service by the Admiralty at the outbreak of war. Music. On the 29th of May, 1940, she docked alongside the East Mole and took on board 600 men. Music. As she steamed away bound for Britain, she took a direct hit from Stuka dive bombers, causing her to catch on fire. For an attempt to save the men, the captain ordered her to run aground on the beach here. But despite his efforts, 300 were killed since that day. Over 80 years ago, the wreck of the HMS Crested Eagle has lain here battered by the tide and picked over for shellfish by locals. It's doubtful she will last another 80. But today, she still remains as one of the last visible traces of Operation Dynamo here at Dunkirk. Music. She was just one of hundreds of ships of all sizes that were deployed. Music, from huge naval transporters to the famous flotilla of little ships, and just one of over 250 that were wrecked all along the coast despite the enormous losses of both men and material. Operation Dynamo saw 338,000 Allied troops transported to safety. It was a victory of sorts, snatched from certain defeat. And in uncertain future, music, laughs, music, the scars on the buildings, the mole, and the wrecks that litter the coast all serve as a lasting reminder of that incredible 10 days in the summer of 1940 that kept Britain in the war. Music. After 3 years of almost non-stop victories for the Axis powers, things began to look a little different. The Nazi invasion into the USSR began to falter, stuck fast by the icy eastern winter, and the USA, provoked by the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, entered the war on the side of the Allies. Music, with the might of the U.S. to the west and a wounded but not yet defeated Soviet Union to the east, Hitler faced the nightmare position of fighting on two fronts. In response to this, on March 23, 1942, he issued Directive 40. In the days to come, the course of Europe will be seriously exposed to the danger of enemy landings. The improvements of fortifications are to be so made that the main defensive effort lies in those coastal sectors that are the most probable sites for enemy landings. The directive tasked the Third Reich with creating a bristling fortress along the Atlantic coastline. This was a static defense network that was meant to be impenetrable to attack. This was the birth of the Atlantic Wall. Hitler's theory was a defensive wall on the Atlantic coast would protect his flank facing towards the UK and the USA. This would allow him in turn to throw the might of his armies against the Soviet Union, defeat them once and for all before turning his attentions back to the West. This was to be an enormous undertaking, and in order to achieve it, he turned to his gigantic engineering organization Todt. Founded by ardent National Socialist Fritz Todt, he oversaw the biggest civil and military engineering projects in the Reich, from the building of the Autobahn to the Siegfried Line. However, the Atlantic Wall would be a project on another level entirely, and the man responsible for it was Organization Todt's Franz Xavier Dorsch. The question was where to start. Music. Nazi high command were convinced that the Allies would need a major port as a gateway into Europe, so places like Ostend or Calais or Esbjerg here in Denmark. And so it was these ports that were bolstered with new defenses. They were the first bastions of the Atlantic Wall. Music. These ports became fortresses packed with men and materials to repel any attempt at capturing the port and allowing the Allies a foothold in Europe. Music. But it became very clear to Nazi high command that there were still vast swathes of undefended European shoreline to remedy. This Hitler ordered a new directive. He wanted 15,000 bunkers built along the entirety of the European coast, and he wanted it done in 7 months, an impossible task. Hitler was now obsessed by his wall. Albert Speer, the Nazi architect, noted that Hitler would be up late at night sketching out bunker designs, himself remarking that his designs met all the requirements of a frontline soldier. Not wishing to question the Führer's wisdom, these designs were often adopted without revision by the Todt engineers. The west coast of Denmark has some of the best preserved remains of the Atlantic Wall, stretching almost as far as the eye can see down the coastline. There are hundreds of bunkers right on the beaches. These pillboxes and bunker emplacements were built for a variety of reasons, some as forward observation posts, others as machine gun or anti-tank emplacements. One thing they have in common is that they are all built to a very specific set of rules. Regelbau. The Regelbau was a sort of instruction guide on how to build the bunkers, determining the thickness of the wall's position of gun ports and the facilities inside. It meant that whether it was here in Denmark, up in Norway, or down the Normandy coast, they would be built exactly the same way, tested and measured to provide the right defensive and offensive power. The Regelbau also meant that these flat-packed bunkers could be erected quickly with whatever unskilled labor that could be found in the local population, whether forced labor or even paid local labor. The bunkers could be erected en masse. The bunkers were first made from wooden scaffolding into which the concrete was then poured. Even today, you can still see the impressions from the wooden planking in the concrete. Once set, heavy metal doors and gun slits would be fitted, and the weapon systems would then be introduced. Machine guns or anti-tank cannon. These would be the front line against any Allied invasion. Hitler and Goebbels were quick to capitalize on the new sections of the Atlantic Wall. They pumped out masses of propaganda, both to the German people and their enemies. The message was clear: Germany was still a force to be reckoned with. Invade at your peril, Deutschland foreign. But despite the bold propaganda about the Atlantic Wall, in private questions were being asked about the value of the wall project. Albert Speer was concerned about the escalating cost: billions of Reichsmarks, over 17 million cubic yards of concrete, and 1.2 million metric tons of iron in barely 2 years. Material and money that was being directed away from Germany's desperate armaments industry. There were also concerns about just how effective the wall would be should an invasion come. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the commander-in-chief of Western forces, remarked that it was merely a propaganda wall and pointed out that it doesn't suffice to build a few pillboxes. One needs defense in depth. Despite the efforts of Dorsch and Organization Todt, by the May deadline, only 30% of the 15,000 bunkers that Hitler ordered were complete. In November 1943, a new man took over the role as General Inspector of Western Defenses, the Desert Fox, Field Marshal Rommel. Music. Rommel was appointed commander of the Afrika Korps in 1941, and he had witnessed firsthand the Allies' ability to plant troops on Nazi-held shores. On assuming his new role, he immediately took a tour of the length of the Atlantic Wall to inspect the work that had already been done and assess its effectiveness in any upcoming battle. Music. Rommel was far from impressed. He knew the battle for Europe was going to be won and lost on these beaches and the bunkers, and the men here were far from up to the job. So Rommel was set to his task of trying to improve these defenses and make them viable for the defense of Europe. Music. Albert Speer remembered one particularly blunt conversation between Hitler and Rommel after his tour of the Atlantic Wall. He was critical of the design of the bunkers and said we must repulse the enemy at his first landing site. The pillboxes around the ports don't do the trick. Only primitive but effective barriers and obstacles all along the coast can make the landing so difficult that our countermeasures will be effective. Rommel continued the bunker building that Dorsch started the previous year, but instead of spreading them across the length of the beaches, they were organized into wider stands to resistance points. Music. This allowed the bunkers to work in concert with one another and concentrate their firepower, and Rommel started a mass project of littering Europe's beaches with those primitive barriers that he had previously mentioned to Hitler. Czech hedgehogs and Belgian gates would ensure the Nazis dictated where the Allies would land if they wanted to get into Europe, and minefields would be packed into areas that were less well defended. By bunkers in Denmark alone, over 1.5 million mines were planted. The Atlantic coast was to be turned into a kill zone for invading Allied forces. In the end, Rommel had less than a year to implement his changes. On the 6th of June, 1944, just 7 months after he became Inspector General, the Allies launched their attempt to liberate Europe. The Atlantic Wall would finally face its ultimate test. The Allies, of course, would invade Normandy, where bunkers like this and pillboxes would provide some level of defense, yet the overwhelming Allied force would eventually break through. This would be a fatal blow for Hitler and his Third Reich. Thank you. The Atlantic Wall project was fatally flawed. It scaled too large, and despite the efforts of Rommel, the line of defense was just too thin to withstand an invasion on the scale of D-Day. After more than 2 years in the making, the wall was punctured in less than a day. But it's important to remember that the Allies also outsmarted the Germans. They didn't want to test their invasion fleet up against any of the heavily defended ports, and instead developed their ingenious Mulberry harbors, which allowed them the luxury of finding more lightly defended sectors of the Atlantic Wall to attack. Music. Ultimately, though, the effectiveness of the wall could only be tested in battle, and once it failed, there was no way back. The thousands of men and guns that were here in Denmark and in Norway, the Netherlands, and Belgium set in concrete and facing towards Britain were rendered useless. The Atlantic Wall failed in its primary purpose to protect the Third Reich, but despite the best efforts of man and nature, it still stands today as a lasting monument to the Second World War. This is Alderney, tiny scrap of land in the English Channel, part of the Channel Islands archipelago, but its size belies its importance. It's played a strategic part in British and French history, because that's the French coast just over there, and yet these islands for, well, 1,000 years or so have on and off mostly belonged to the English and British, and that means that this island has a wealth of historical sites quite out of proportion to its small size. I'm exploring the remnants of Alderney's military occupiers, from Roman ramparts to the mega bunkers built by the Wehrmacht. Music. Nowhere gives a sense of the breadth of Alderney's history better than this place here, because this actually takes us back, well, to some of the earliest recorded history in Alderney. It's Roman. Check out that wall. That's actually a Roman remain. It's got to be one of the best Roman remains I've ever seen in the British Isles. You can see the herringbone formation there. What's interesting is that the arch in the middle is 18th century, when the British came to refortify this Roman fort against the French threat of the French Revolution. The walls have been surrounded by sand over the centuries as they had to extend this arch up. And if you look at the very top level here above that herringbone, you can see the 18th century addition. But the most remarkable thing about this building is it wasn't just fortified by the British in the 18th century, but by another occupier even later on. So the Roman structure was used by the British. It was sort of reoccupied, refortified by the British in the 18th century, which gives it its sort of 18th century character inside here, but some rather incongruous clues that show what happened during the Second World War, when this island became a vital German defensive stronghold. Look, the closer you look, the more concrete you see into these walls under the ground here. The Germans burrowed bunkers, machine gun positions, and it's got the Edelweiss up here, so there's very few places in the world that I've been where it shows military occupation by the Romans, the British, and then the Wehrmacht. Music. The Germans used existing structures. They built new structures and created a giant interconnected stronghold here on Alderney. This is fascinating. This is the only example in existence in Europe, a German machine gun position, where the gun is braced on these little notches here, and someone can stand in here and feed fresh ammunition into it. And as you can see here, this machine gun crew would have a perfect field of fire along that beach. But this is just one of hundreds of military structures right across this tiny island. Music. When France fell to the Germans in June 1940, the decision was made to demilitarize and abandon the Channel Islands. The British government realized they couldn't put up any resistance against German forces now. They were so close in occupied France. In Alderney, the civilian population was evacuated. They left on British ships and were taken either to other Channel Islands or to the British mainland, and that meant that when the Germans landed, they found this place almost completely empty. This is Alderney's harbor, and as a result, it is incredibly strongly defended. You can see fortification on the far side, but look at the headland I'm on now. Everywhere, as far as the eye can see, dotted with bunkers, gun positions, searchlight positions. We know that in the immediate area here, there were 11 artillery pieces, including anti-tank guns that could have fired at ships or troops landing in this area here, and also 9 anti-aircraft guns, which can actually be lowered so they can fire at targets on the surface as well. So this was an incredibly strong position. It feels like Alderney had been turned into one gigantic, static, potent battleship out here in the sea. As the Second World War progressed, it became clear to the Germans that the Allies were planning a major invasion of Western Europe, gathering forces in Britain. In response, the Germans decided to fortify the Channel Islands, turning them into a theoretically impregnable string of fortresses that would guard the stretch of French coast to the west of the Cotentin Peninsula. Now Alderney might be one of the smallest of the Channel Islands, but it became the most heavily fortified. Gun platforms like this one here were built now right here in the middle. They'd have mounted big naval guns of the kinds that were installed on German battleships, and these would have allowed the Germans to close off this passage. Over there you can see Guernsey, or you can see Jersey. The guns here would overlap with guns fired over there, forming a kind of invisible wall through which Allied shipping wouldn't be allowed to pass over there as the coast of France. So on the other side of Alderney, you'd have guns that would close off that gap as well. So this whole stretch of French coast and these coastal convoy routes that the Germans wanted to take would be protected. Alderney was covered in concrete. The Germans burrowed into the earth. That's why I'm standing now. You've got this huge gun platform. Each one was protected against invasion. There were 3 rings of barbed wire around this one. There was a minefield There were flamethrowers over there on those two little hillocks. There was anti-aircraft gun emplacements in the middle. There was a strong point, dozens and dozens of these kind of features absolutely littered this tiny island, turning it into one massive fortress. Barring the Roman fort overlooking the island's harbor, Alderney was home to very few fortifications up until the 18th century. In this period, Britain and France continued to compete for world domination, and the threat of an amphibious invasion of southern England was always on the cards, magnifying the strategic importance of the Channel Islands. This is a particularly fascinating site. This is what Torgey now we think, well, somewhere around here on this headland. There would have been an 18th century gun battery during the 18th century. Britain and France were fighting basically for control of the world global hegemony. In the 19th century, Britain and France again found themselves in competition. It was a huge naval arms race, and the Victorians built a lot of forts around the coast of the British Isles. But nowhere more remarkable than this one here, this protected other the coast here in Alderney, got Bray Harbor over there. This was a place where French troops could have landed, so you've got these giant gun platforms here built by the Victorians facing out to sea. But what's amazing about this place is basically on top of this Victorian site, you have German defenses added on. You literally can see on top of these Georgian foundations, you've got the concrete here. And there would have been German machine guns here, larger caliber German weapons. This headland would have bristled with defensive weaponry. Check out down here. So this is wonderful you're coming through. These thick Victorian walls now down this tunnel. At the bottom, you leave the red brick of the Victorian period behind, and you have the concrete of wartime construction, and down here, you have German gun emplacements, anti-tank weapons, and machine gun positions. Look at that classic beach there at Bray Harbor, an ideal place where enemy troops might land, and this gun is just able to sweep that entire area. So this German fort built on top of the Victorian fort would have had well up to 70 German soldiers in it, and a garrison of Alderney, it was something like 3,500, and then plus 4,000 slave labor is remarkable. So this is where the big German gun would have been, as you can see, sweeping that beach, dealing with landing craft or attacking troops. And there would have been about 4 big guns of this caliber in this German fort, and then numerous machine guns, really too many to have left. An accurate record. What really strikes me when I look around this place and seeing the size and the scale is the thought that this was a huge complex. Really, there would have been a crew here protected from naval aerial bombardment or assault from the sea. There would have been a generator. There was a huge amount of ammunition here. There'd have been cooking facilities and sewerage, and that all had been brought together, had all been built here just to keep one gun in operation. Music, construction, and maintenance of the fortifications on the island was not easy, especially with the threat of Allied air attacks. The RAF launched numerous bombing raids on the Channel Islands, 22 in total, throughout the war, aiming to destroy German bunkers and disable gun emplacements. The Germans had to be prepared. So it wasn't just guns that were positioned all over the coast here in Alderney. They needed searchlights, because many of the giant Allied air formations that struck targets in Europe would do so at night. So this is a great example of a searchlight position. These have been huge searchlights, 60 centimeters in diameter. They had to be moved on these tracks, and they'd have been here on the coast looking to pick out these giant Allied air armadas as they're heading over to bomb targets, particularly in July and August of 1944 in the Great Battle for Normandy. And then once they've been picked up, then the German anti-aircraft positions could try and shoot them down. There were 37 searchlights of 60 centimeters in diameter and above on Alderney alone. Music, just driving around Alderney, you get a sense of the concentration of military architecture on this island, going right back to the Romans. Then a lot, of course, the Victorian stuff still remaining, but the Second World War features are everywhere across this island. It's impossible to go more than a few meters without seeing a little bunker, little piece of concrete sticking out of the undergrowth. It's one of the most remarkable places. Next, I would be traveling to the northern tip of Alderney to see one of those impressive World War II fortifications at Babette Head. It's a remarkable bunker. I've ever really seen anything like this one. They've even laid it with rock that they've picked up from the beach around and about, and they've disguised the outside of this bunker to make it try and blend in with this rocky headland that I'm on. So inside here, it's just another giant complex to house big beach defense guns, artillery pieces. Then there would have been machine guns, so the loopholes in the wall, and then places for the crew to live as well. Apparently, it's a long tunnel. Yeah, here we go, a long tunnel connecting us with another casemate, actually with another artillery position out on the headland. Let's go scale of this construction effort is extraordinary, and I'm constantly getting surprised every time I go to a new bunker. You think you've seen it all, wow. And this bit's very badly flooded, oh yeah that. Chamber beyond, as well I think I might at this point. Turn back rather than have wet feet for the rest of my expedition in Alderney. Music, applause, music, applause, music. Although they're less immediately obvious than the giant German concrete emplacements also crisscrossing this island, are these trenches now? You might think you'd be more likely to find trenches like this on the battlefields of the First World War, the Western Front, Flanders, etc., but actually they were used during the Second World War, particularly here on Alderney to link different German positions together, and you can see this one is hewn out of the living rock, stretches all the way up behind me up to that fortress on the hill. Foreign allows the German defenders, German garrison to move between different positions, always staying low, staying below ground level. And this is a mortar position of a mortar here. This trench system actually joins a couple of different mortar positions together. A mortar is a gun, basically, that fires bombs high up in the air, then on the heads of your enemy. After a long tour of the island's defensive structures, tunnels, and trenches, it was time to head to Alderney's most iconic World War II landmark. Music. I'm on the eastern tip of Alderney now, and you get a fantastic view from here across the Narrows to France. That's the tip of the Cotentin Peninsula in Normandy. And look how close we are to France, only about 9 kilometers away. And look at that tide ripping through there, one of the most infamous tidal races in the world now. This was the gap that the Germans wanted to protect. And so this artillery here would work with this gigantic building here. This was effectively kind of a rangefinder and observation tower. Each of those 3 layers had German observers looking out to sea, and then each of the 3 layers talked to a different battery. Underground telephone cables went out to a battery of big heavy guns that could then work to bring down gigantic weight of fire on enemy ships spotted through their scopes. Enemy ships foolish enough to try and get through this gap, because there's another set of giant artillery pieces on the French coast as well. So, between Alderney and the guns over there, this gap, this route along the coast of France was shut to Allied shipping. Music. Not the most accessible bunker in the world, but worth it. Because look at this. This is wall painting murals from the 1940s. And what's fascinating is that the German crew down here obviously try to create, well, make it sort of comfortable. Try to beautify it slightly, because they didn't particularly enjoy living in a concrete box underground. Look at this. Oh, yeah, look, this is fantastic still chipboard. So providing a sort of inner wall covering up the concrete, just making the room feel a bit warmer, feel a bit less barren. And these, there would have been, I think, beds that would have hung down from here. You've still got some of the fittings up there. So they would have had chain bunks along here. Wow, check this out. Incredibly beautiful painting here. And then you've got some German words here, which I think is a danger of death if you don't close that valve. Funny juxtaposition, warning people of mortal danger right next door to this rather beautiful sort of flowery and leafy motif here. Music. And those that were in mortal danger were the thousands of slave laborers brought over to Alderney from Europe and North Africa. As part of Nazi construction programs, the workforce also included natives of the Channel Islands. The gigantic scale of military building here on Alderney required a huge army of workers to finish it, and those workers were found from around Hitler's Nazi empire and moved here by force. They were forced laborers. They were housed in a number of camps around Alderney, of which very little remains. They were deconstructed after the war, and they were housed in such flimsy and miserable conditions that little of it is still upstanding, unlike the huge concrete structures that they built. But here you can see the remains of some of the accommodation in one of the camps, the hard standing down there, which would have been covered with a flimsy shelter. The conditions under which those laborers were held were pretty brutal. They were denied access to health care and proper food, and many of them died whilst being forced to work on this island. 700 camp inmates lost their lives before the camps were closed, and the remaining inmates transferred to France in 1944. Channel Islanders were liberated in 1945 following the German surrender and the horrors of the only concentration camp to be built on British soil were exposed. Channel Islands remained in German hands almost till the very last hours of the Second World War. The Allies bypassed them. They liberated France. They moved into the Low Countries, into Germany, and brought the Second World War in Europe to a close, leaving these islands in German hands, so all of the work that had been done to fortify them, protect them from an Allied amphibious assault of work that cost the lives of so many of the thousands of slave laborers that were brought here was in vain. When the people of Alderney returned, they found an island that was much changed, tens of thousands of landmines, trench systems, bunkers, concrete fortifications crisscrossing their home. And those had been built by slave laborers, many of whom had been worked to death, and the islanders immediately responded by building this rather moving memorial to those slave laborers, the French language, Hebrew, Polish, reflecting the different nationalities of people that were brought here by the Nazis in order to turn this into one mighty fortress. The interwar period saw a flurry of defensive structures being built across Europe. France built its famous Maginot Line, and the Germans replied in turn with the Siegfried Line. Music, and the same was seen here in Belgium, particularly in the area around Liège. The crown jewel of the Belgian defenses was ebony mail. Music. It was vital not just to the defense of Belgium, but Western Europe, but if you didn't know, it was here you might actually miss it. Music. The amazing thing about ebony mail is that from the surface you can't see the true extent of this fortress. Instead, to see this engineering marvel, you need to go deeper underground. Music. Because ebony mail isn't built on top of the hill. It's the hill completed in 1935. The fort dug into St. Peter's Mount was at the cutting edge of fortress technology, and on top there are just the smallest hints of the super fortress that lurks beneath. Ebony mail covers an enormous 750,000 square meters, and it is crisscrossed with 5 kilometers of tunnels and staircases linking the 17 bunkers with the rest of the fort. The fort could support up to 1,200 men at one time, and to make life as comfortable for them as possible, ebony mail was fitted with the most modern amenities. Warm showers, full electric and state-of-the-art ventilation systems helped keep fresh air circulating even in the deepest parts of the fortress, should they need to. The men of ebony mail could continue the fight against the enemy for months. Patient here were not crack infantrymen or special forces operatives. Instead, they were skilled artillerists. The men of ebony mail wouldn't be going hand to hand with the enemy. Rather, they would rain down fire from miles away, safe inside their super fortress. Ebony mail was built at a strategically critical position. Its garrison of artillery men dominated the surrounding landscape, including key crossings over the River Meuse and Albert Canal, as well as critical roads leading west towards Brussels and the French border. In 1914, the Germans had used Liège as their first step in the Schlieffen Plan, the invasion of Western Europe at the beginning of World War I. Ebony mail was here to stop any future German attacks that wanted to take the same route, but to dominate the surrounding landscape. Ebony mail needed some big guns. The fort bristled with 17 artillery positions, and even more machine guns and anti-tank emplacements. 4 of the casemates housed a trio of 75mm guns, with each casemate trained on a specific target. Ebony mail also boasted a number of fully rotating artillery cupolas, 2 containing another pair of 75mm guns, and a final one containing a pair of 120mm guns that had a range of 17 kilometers. Music. Inside the fort, each casemate and cupola was served by an elevator room like this. It was used to hoist the massive shells the 60 meters from safe storage to the guns above. For the men, there was no such luxury. There was one way in and one way out. The 126-step staircase pictures of the bloody, dirty hand-to-hand fighting of the First World War still loomed large in the collective consciousness, and ebony mail was in part a reaction to that. The target was now just a set of coordinates. You didn't even need to see the enemy or put yourself in harm's way. This was clinical war for the 20th century. The impregnability of ebony mail was famed across Europe. The 60-meter high cliff face overlooking the Albert Canal on one side, and then a network of ditches and pillboxes protecting the rest. It was a fact that wasn't lost on Hitler. He knew that ebony mail could prove to be an unfortunate stumbling block for the invasion of the West. German military planners reasoned that it would take weeks and cost thousands of lives to break into this fortress, if it was even possible. And so Hitler had to think outside of the box. The bunkers and tunnels of ebony mail were perfect for the defender, and so Hitler himself designed an attack that would take advantage of one of the things the Belgians hadn't counted on: an assault from the skies. No footage from the actual attack exists. This was, after all, a top-secret operation, but Hitler was so proud of it and of the outcome that he had this specially produced propaganda film made to show to the German public at 5:25 a.m. on the 10th of May. 1949 German gliders silently cruised down on top of the fortress, the first glider assault in world history. Had been launched, the 78 men of Grupp Granite were under strict instructions. They didn't need to capture the fortress. They just needed to blunt its offensive power. German reconnaissance had identified the locations of the batteries, and now the group went about their business quickly and methodically. They brought with them flamethrowers and novel 50-kilogram shaped charges designed to focus the explosive energy of the weapon. They had no need to try and break in an ebon email. They would smash the guns from the outside. Confusion inside ebon email reigned. In fact, some of the garrison didn't even realize they were under attack. One famous incident saw a Belgian officer calling a casemate wanting an urgent update in German, then answer the call, and after listening to a moment of panic French, he coolly replied, "Here are the Germans." Within a few hours, the guns had been silenced. Ebon email was crippled music. The Belgian army launched a desperate attempt to free the fort, but they were repelled from the massive garrison of almost 1,000 Belgian troops. 24 were killed, and ebon email, once a crown jewel of Belgian defenses, became a prison for the rest. On the 11th of May, the fort formally surrendered. It was a stunning victory and was so highly prized by Hitler that he personally thanked each man who participated. Music was, and still is, a fantastic feat of engineering, but it was built to fight the war of the past, not the one of the future. The Allied invasion of Normandy in June 1944 was one of the most spectacular pieces of military planning in history, with every element planned to the tiniest detail. But one of the biggest problems the Allied planners faced was exactly how to provide the invasion force with the supplies they needed to sustain the assault, and without access to a major French port, the disastrous Dieppe raid in 1942 had showed that capturing a heavily fortified French port would be extremely costly and had absolutely no guarantee of success. And so Allied planners came up with a rather ingenious solution. Instead of risking the lives of thousands of troops by taking a port like Le Havre or Cherbourg, the Allies decided to bring one with them. And you can still find remnants of that on the beaches of Arromanches. Arromanches was at the heart of the Gold Invasion beach, but planners spared it from abroad of the invasion. It would be here that Mulberry, be later known as Port Winston, would be built. But of course, it wasn't as simple as digging a few piers into the sand and watching the tanks roll off. To support the scale of the invasion, the harbor would need to be built both on a huge scale and fast, even as the Allied troops were fighting their way off the beaches in the morning of the 6th of June. 1944, the first components of the harbor were being tugged over the channel to Arromanches, and on the 8th building began. It all started with the enormous breakwater, and I've come up to the cliffs to the west of Arromanches to get a better view. Music. The harbor wall here at Arromanches measured over 5 miles long, and it was made up of these concrete caissons, each 60 meters long and 8 meters wide. The building of the different components of the harbor started at the end of 1943, with the work taking place across the UK, from the Thames estuary to the Scottish coast. Once the caissons were made, they were then purposely sunk to keep them out of sight of prying enemy eyes before being refloated in the days leading up to the invasion. It was this resurrection that gave them their code name Phoenix. But these Phoenix blocks were just a single part of the huge Mulberry operation, and back down on the beach, you can find other bits of evidence of the harbor standing right here in the middle of the beach, just a few hundred meters from the town center. Is the centerpiece of the remains. This is a huge piece of a pier head codenamed Spud. Music. It was on these platforms that men and supplies were unloaded, the first step for many of the invasion. Thousands of tons of steel and concrete went into making the Mulberry Harbor. But despite this, the entire harbor was designed to float. It needed to not only support the weight of an army, but also flex with the rising and falling tide. The roadways, codename whales, floated on these massive floats called beetles, and the spuds were hollow. It was, and still is, an astonishing achievement on the beach today. You can see just a fraction of what would have been here in June 1944. The harbor here was built up of 33 jetties and 10 miles of floating roadway. Once Port Winston was complete, it rivaled the size of Dover, and it's still considered one of the greatest achievements in military engineering. But what's most amazing is that they didn't just build one, they built two. Just a few miles down the coast, on the American landing beach of Omaha at the French town of Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer-Mulberry, it was built less than 2 weeks after the invasion. Both the harbors were functional, allowing a steady flow of men and armaments onto the continent. But on the 19th of June, disaster struck. When the worst storm in 40 years blew through Normandy, it ripped Mulberry A from the sea floor, leaving it irreparably damaged. Mulberry B, which had slightly better protection from the storm, survived, but only just rapid repairs were made, and for the next 10 months. Port Winston landed 2.5 million men, 500,000 vehicles, and 4 million tons of other supplies. It lasted 7 months longer than expected and was a vital part of the Allied logistical plan. Foreign harbors have reached the end of their operational life. They still had an important role to play, and if you know where to look, you can find parts of them today over the River Noiro, an hour to the south of Arromanches. Deep in the Norman countryside, there is a rather functional-looking bridge. It's, in fact, a remaining section of one of the whale roads in the aftermath of the Normandy campaign. The Mulberry Harbor was sliced up and used to patch up the French road network. And here, almost 80 years later, it's still performing its job. The Mulberry Harbors are still held up as being a marvel of military engineering admired the world over, with perhaps the most telling praise of all coming from Nazi architect Albert Speer, who said to construct our defenses we had in 2 years used some 13 million cubic meters of concrete and 1.5 million tons of steel a fortnight. After the landings by the enemy, this costly effort was brought to nothing because of an idea of simple genius. Music. Scattered along the West German border in fields next to streams and forests, there are strange structures, lumps of concrete and twisted steel poking out of the ground. Music. These are the remains of one of the most daring projects of Hitler's rule, the Siegfried Line, long before the outbreak of the Second World War. Hitler had plans on German expansion to the east. However, he was concerned about the response of the West, so to deter any Western Allied intervention, he wanted to build a line of defenses at his rear, his Siegfried Line. The Siegfried Line was made up of bunkers, ditches, tank traps, and minefields running 400 miles along the German border with France, Luxembourg, and the Low Countries. In 1936, Germany remilitarized the Rhineland, and construction of the mighty West Wall could begin. However, progress was too slow for Hitler, and so in 1938, he handed the task over to his engineering genius Fritz Todt, who immediately set about building the defensive line of Hitler's dreams. He put more than 500,000 men to work on the project, using millions of tons of gravel and cement and thousands of coils of barbed wire. Within 4 months, he had built 10,000 bunkers and innumerable belts of tank traps. It was an astonishing feat, as the project continued to pace. Hitler was noted to have said that no power on Earth would be able to break through the most gigantic fortified zone of all time, and for a long time, he was right. For almost 6 years, the Siegfried Line lay intact and almost untested, impeding no one other than the local farmers. But having successfully broken out of Normandy by the end of August 1944, Allied forces were keen to press home their advantage, whilst British and Commonwealth troops pressed north into the Low Countries. The Americans were given the task of driving straight to Germany. The most direct route was through the Hürtgen Forest on Germany's border with Belgium, but to get through they would have to smash through the Siegfried Line, and it's around the Hürtgen Forest that you can still find some of the best preserved remains. Thank you. This belt of defenses sits just outside the village of Rotgen, that's situated right on the German border with Belgium. This would be the first line of defense. The whole point of the Siegfried Line was that would stop the Allied advance into Germany. It was built up of row after row of defensive structures that were designed to sap the advancing Allied